Buddhism is an ancient tradition with answers to life's biggest questions today. Why do we suffer? How do we relate to other beings? And how do we make the world a happier and more peaceful place for everyone? Our mission at BDK America is to help people understand Buddhism better. Are you looking to start learning about Buddhism or dig deeper? BDK America offers free books and videos for peoples of all ages and levels. Our most popular book, The Teaching of Buddha, is available to read in English and 46 other languages in physical, PDF, and audiobook formats. Visit our website for our latest publications and order your own free copy today.
Hi, how are you doing today? For our regular viewers, we hope that our program is making a difference in your lives. And if you have joined us for the first time, welcome. In today's show, we wish to continue with our discussion of the third mark of existence. That is, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, or simply, life is impermanent. As I mentioned previously, we are able to understand this truth with our head, but are not often able to fully put this concept into practice in our lives. As today's opening passage tells us, we often worry about the future or hold on to the regrets from the past. Let me recite the passage again. To worry in anticipation or to cherish regret for the past is like the reeds that are cut and wither away. In other words, we are encouraged not to be overly attached to the past or worry about the future, for if we do, we are like a lifeless reed. In today's show, I wish to emphasize the need for us to be open to change, which is the third of three dimensions of the third mark of existence. The other two dimensions that we discussed in two previous shows were to fully understand the truth with our total being and to live fully in the present. We are stressing this need to be open, not closed, to change, for it is often more difficult to practice than we anticipate. This is due in part to our human nature to cling to what is familiar, especially when we are happy with the situation we are in. This characteristic or trait is perhaps nowhere better exemplified than by a couple of characters from a popular book called Who Moved My Cheese by Dr. Spencer Johnson. I'm sure some of you have read it. Although it is not a Buddhist book per se, I found the story to be extremely effective in conveying many of the valuable points I wish to make in relation to the Buddhist teaching, life is impermanent. Well, once upon a time, in a land far away, there lived four little characters who ran through a maze looking for cheese to nourish them and make them happy. Two were mice named Sniff and Scurry, and two were little people named Hem and Haw, who were as small as mice but looked and acted a lot like people today. Well, one day they found a huge cheese near Cheese Station C at the end of one of the corridors in the maze. They were naturally overjoyed with this find. Every morning, the two mice, Sniff and Scurry, went to Cheese Station C to nibble at the delicious cheese. When they got there, they took off their running shoes, then tied them together and hung them around their neck so they could get to their shoes when needed. In contrast, Hem and Haw settled in and made themselves at home at Station C. They took off their shoes and changed into their comfortable slippers. They felt secure and proud of their huge cheese, so much so that they soon moved their home nearby. One day when they arrived at Cheese Station C, the cheese had disappeared completely. Hem and Haw couldn't believe it, and Hem hollered out in anger and disbelief, "Who moved my cheese?" In contrast, Sniff and Scurry weren't surprised, for they had noticed that the cheese was growing smaller and were prepared for the inevitable. They simply looked at each other, removed their shoes hung conveniently around their necks, put them on, and were quickly off in search of the next cheese. Ham and Hall ranted and raved. They felt it was their cheese and that their rights were violated. "It's not fair," they cried out. Then they began to blame others, who were now seen to be responsible for the disappearance of the cheese. And they chose to wait at Cheese Station C for it to reappear. However, day after day, the two little people were disappointed, for the cheese did not return. Ham and Hall became weary and exhausted. Soon, Hall began to have second thoughts about their response and suggested that they began looking for a new cheese like Sniff and Scurry. However, Ham scoffed at the mice, who were only responding instinctively. Surely, they were smarter than the mice and would figure out a way for the cheese to reappear again. But as they became physically weaker and failed to figure out what to do, Hall stepped out of Station C in search of new cheese, while Ham continued to resist change and cling to the past. Hall felt better and liberated to be looking rather than merely doing nothing. Of course, he was not without anxiety. He was afraid to leave the comfortable environment of Cheese Station C, and yet at the same time he was afraid that he would not find a new cheese. But it soon dawned on him that between the two fears, he felt more empowered to move forward, to take on the fear and anxiety of what uncertainties lie ahead, than remain afraid and just wait and hope for the cheese to reappear. And as he moved forward into the maze, he felt more invigorated by the anticipation of where the path would take him. He also realized that things were not as bad as he had imagined. In fact, what he had imagined was far worse than the actual reality. He regretted all the time he wasted on thinking negative thoughts and being gripped by the fear of the unknown. Instead, he began to think in a more positive manner, seeing himself finding and savoring the new cheese. Then, as he turned one corner, he came upon a huge cheese that filled an entire cavern at Cheese Station N. It was the biggest supply of cheese he had ever seen, certainly much larger than the one that had disappeared. For a moment, he thought it was just his imagination, but he knew it wasn't when he saw Sniff and Scurry already there with their fat little bellies welcoming Hall to the new cheese. This parable is highly instructive and conveys a number of vital points for us to keep in mind about the truth of impermanence and how we can respond to changes in our life. First, undesirable changes often seem to take place unexpectedly, without warning. But under closer scrutiny, we learn that many changes are foreseeable. The two mice anticipated the inevitable change. They were always ready to respond quickly. In stark contrast, Ham and Hall were not. As a result, they were unwilling to look at the reality, even as the size of the cheese began to dwindle. Second, in an ever-changing world, we cannot claim things as mine, as a child often does with his toys. As Ham and Hall experienced, we are bound to be disappointed if we feel we are entitled to things. For changes are often the result of numerous conditions and forces that are far beyond our control. There is nothing that we can own permanently. Also, our reluctance to move with the changes is often rooted in our anxiety about the future and fear of failure. It often feels more secure to stay with the familiar. But here, as well, lurks the uneasiness or apprehension of clinging to the past. So either way, one experiences fear and anxiety. As Hall learned, when faced with two choices, it is often better to take on the anxiety of the future than to remain entrenched in the anxiety of the past. At the same time, the reality is often better than what we had imagined. We have a strong tendency to imagine the worst and thereby resist any proactive responses to change. Yes, there are obstacles to overcome and challenges to be met in adapting to changes, but the situation is often not as dire as one had thought. Last but not least, it is important to remember that while things are going badly now, this negative situation will eventually pass, for that is the nature of impermanence. There will be bumps at times, but our lives will not always be rocky and unsure. The truth of impermanence helps us to be optimistic when things are not going well, because they will and do change for the better. Traditionally, the Buddhist teaching has encouraged non-attachment because all things change, and certainly that is important to keep in our minds. As contemporary lay Buddhists, we can practice non-attachment to an extent in the form of maintaining a sense of levity, lightheartedness, and humor about ourselves. Hall realized this when he saw how silly they both looked. He felt more alive as he was finally able to laugh at himself and announce, "It's May's time." Then he started off in search of new cheese. On the other hand, Hem didn't laugh or try to see a brighter side and continued to be miserable. I hope that in the event that our cheese disappears, we would respond like the two mice. But if we cannot, we would at least be like Hall. Otherwise, we would be miserable and afraid like Hem. Well, please join us next week when we interview Professor Jidong Chen, whose involvement in the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989 sparked his dedication to Buddhism.
We at Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai pursue peace and happiness for people around the world. We have published the Buddhist teachings into 41 languages and donated our publication to hotels and other facilities in 55 countries. We would like to share the Buddhist teachings with people around the world. That's our mission. Visit our website for more information.